Well, welcome to Geveracom, where the wise get wiser. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the ninth letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And we're also going to look at a couple key words, one being the word for good, very famous word, and also the words for clean and unclean, very important ideas throughout the Bible. And so with this, we're also going to read a couple verses, one from Genesis 1, and then one from Psalm 106. And so both of these are going to help us to learn and understand some of our key words. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with our alphabet. So, of course, we're going to be learning this ninth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is called the Tet. But before we get there, let's, as we normally do, practice our alphabet just a little bit. So we're going to go through it quickly first, and then a little more slowly. So follow along if you can. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, let's do it a little more slowly. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. So once more, a little more quickly. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, that's our alphabet. So let's go ahead and get into our letter here, the letter Tet. Tet. And as you can see here, it's our ninth letter. So let's talk a little bit about how you draw this or write this. So of course, get out a piece of paper, grab a pen, and practice. That's going to be the best way for you to not only remember it, but also to really kind of formulate what's important about this letter so that you can pick it up more quickly. Well, this one's kind of simple in a way because it's kind of like maybe the English U, if you will. So you basically just kind of draw this sort of half little loop, half circle thing here, an upside down arch. But one thing that is somewhat important, I suppose, is that it does curve in on itself, as we see here. So over here on the right side, it curves in. So sort of a half circle and then loops in on itself. Okay? And so that's really the extent of the Tet and how to draw it. Now, as you notice in our more fancy form here, this kind of has this little extra piece at the top. And sometimes you could, if you want, draw like a little hat almost, kind of like we saw with the Zayin, if you recall. But it's not necessarily core to the letter, as we'll see in some of our different fonts. So this, of course, is our more biblical font here. And this one has a very nice square bottom to it. But let's look at some of these others. So in this font, as you see, it looks very much almost like a U, but it kind of curls in right at the end there. This one, as you can see as well, basically kind of, just curls in on itself. Almost looks like a lowercase b or something. right? But kind of a similar U almost shape that curls in on itself. This one kind of almost looks like a V, really. Just put that straight, sharp point and then kind of curls in like maybe almost like a half heart or something. So a few different ways that you can write it or that you'll see it in different fonts. Like I mentioned, we're really just learning for biblical Hebrew. So the most important one to know and be familiar with is that more biblical style. But I like showing these different fonts because it kind of gives us a little bit of a variety of the flavor of really, again, what's important, what's core to the letter, so that we can hang on to those as we're getting started here. All right, well, let's also talk just a little bit about the development, right? Some of the earlier forms of the letter. Well, in its earliest forms, the proto-Sinaitic, as you see here, it kind of looks like a little cross with a wheel. So sort of this like wheel with spokes almost type of form. Now, what's interesting is that in the Paleo-Hebrew, it ends up being pretty much about the same. There's a couple of varieties that may correspond, but in general, it actually ends up staying pretty much the same. And I guess that's a pretty simple letter to draw, and so, I guess there was no sense in fixing it because it was easy enough. All right, well, let's talk about the sound. Well, this is the T sound. And as we're also going to learn later on in our alphabet, there is another letter that has the T sound as well. Now, in ancient times, it may have had a slightly different sound between this one and the later T sound. But as far as we've received it in modern times, it's just the T sound. And so that's how we're going to pronounce it for our purposes. Now, this Tet letter is also used as the letter 9, as in Genesis 9, Bereshit Tet. And so this is the Tet with that T sound, the T sound. So nothing too out of the ordinary with this one. It's not like the Het, which is very different from anything in English. This is very, very easily understood and transferred over from English to Hebrew. All right, well, let's learn a couple key words. So as I mentioned, we're going to learn one of these words is very, very important and common. And that's this word over here on the left, tov. Tov. So we have here that tet, and then O, tov, tov. And so this is the word that just means good. It's also a very common greeting. If you say Yom Tov, it means good day or, kind of like hello almost. Now, the other one over here is Tova, Tova. And Tova is just the feminine version of that. So in a kind of similar way, they would say Shana Tova, right? So happy year, or, kind of almost like you'd say Happy New Year. So Shana Tova. So good year or happy year. So Yom Tov, Shana Tova. Right? Good day or good year. All right, so Tova and Tov. All right, and then we have two more words here. And these all both mean very similar things, but taher on the right, taher, is a verb meaning to be purified, or he purified, or maybe he was pure. And then over here on the left, we have tahor, tahor. And so tahor is really more of the adjective form, meaning like it was pure, right? So if you're talking about a vessel or an item, or especially the priests, this is very, very common language when it's talking about the temple and the priestly order. All right, and then we have here the word tameh, which is basically the exact opposite, is to be unclean. Now, what's a little bit weird and interesting about this word, as you notice here, is there's only one form, which can be both either the verb or the adjective. And so it really is going to be context, which helps determine which one it is. So again, we have taher. Taher is clean or pure. Tameh means unclean or unpure, impure, right? So taher, tameh. So, again, that's kind of maybe a little bit tricky or hard to remember. So you might have to write that out, put it on a vocabulary card or flashcard of some sort, make note of it somewhere. But taher is pure, tameh is unclean or impure. All right, and then one last keyword here is the word terem. Terem. And this really just means like before or prior. So it oftentimes will get used in especially poetic verses and places, prophetic stuff, but it just means from the past. So really kind of time oriented, something from the past. All right. So let's now talk about our verse. So like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this verse from Genesis 1:31. And in this verse is where we're going to see that word for good. So of course, God has just told us or created everything in the universe and the world. And after each day, he says that it was good. And so this is at the very end of all of his creation, at the end of the sixth day. And so then we find out that it wasn't just good, but it was very good. So let's go ahead and read it together. So we have here, Va ya re. Vayar Elohim. Vayar Elohim. Vayar Elohim. Vayar Elohim. And so what does that mean? Well, we see that va, which means and as again we'll see very often in narrative and story forms, that yod with the vav. And this one's a little bit tricky because the root word is ra'ah technically, so there should be a hey at the end, and that means to see. And so this actually means and he saw, vayar. And then Elohim, of course, is the word for God. God. And while we're here, I'll just mention, even though we've not learned really any grammar formally, hopefully you kind of picked up on, and we've talked about this a little bit, but the im on the end means plural, right? So gods, even though it's referring to the singular God, as we believe and know. And what's interesting is that this form here is actually the singular form of the verb, meaning he saw. And so that's actually how one of the ways we know that this form of Elohim, God, is referring to one God, because grammatically it's being used with a singular verb. And so it's a little bit unusual. It doesn't really occur for much else in the Hebrew language or the Hebrew Bible. But it does occur in this way with the word Elohim, right? So God saw. God saw. All right. And then we have et kol asher asa. Et kol asher asa. Et kol asher asa. And so if you remember that et is typically not translated into English, it's just letting us know what is not the subject. Kol, which we have talked about, or we've seen, I guess, in a few different verses, and that means all. And then asher is one of those words we looked at, a keyword from when we looked at Aleph, and it means that, which, who, something like that. So God saw all that asa, and this is a verb meaning he made or he did. So God saw all that he did or that he had made. And then the next part here, ve hine tov me od. Ve hine טוב מאוד. וכנה טוב מאוד. All right, so what do we have here? Well, of course, we have that and, so common in Hebrew. So and chene, which is, again, a little bit hard to translate in English. It oftentimes, in kind of biblical terms, gets translated as behold. It could also mean something like look, or, it's really kind of just a hard expression to bring over to English. And so something like, hey, look here, or, pay attention, something kind of emphatic, right? Emphasis given. So in behold, tov, right? What does that mean? Means good. And then meod, and meod means very or much. So, and behold, it was very good. It was very good, right? So everything that God had made, he looks in that first week of creation and says, behold, it is all very, very good. And that's, of course, because we had not yet arrived at, Genesis 3 for sure. So let's go ahead and talk about the next, or the last part of this verse, which is kind of the conclusion to the whole deal. And it says here, Vayehi erev erev Vayehi boker Vayehi erev Vayehi boker Vayehi erev Vayehi boker, or voker. All right, so what does this mean? Well, as we've seen before, that means and, va, plus that yod. So and he, or and it, was erev, evening. So and it was evening. And then again, va and yeah. So and he, or and it, was boker, or voker, morning. So and it was evening, and it was morning. Yom ha-shishi. Yom ha-shishi. So yom, of course, is that word for day. And then ha, the, shishi, which is the kind of the special form for six, meaning sixth day. So this was the sixth day. And so, of course, there's lots of debate as to what does a yom mean? And it's hard to say for sure, because yom gets used at least in a few different ways in just Genesis 1 and 2. We see it gets used in the sense of daylight, like the part of the day that is light. We also see it gets used in a sense of 24 hours, right? And we also find in Genesis 2 that it gets used in the sense of in the day that you eat of the fruit. So it's really kind of more used in the sense of a period of time. And so there's kind of an interesting, ambiguity to the word yom, unfortunately. So in some ways, it very well could be taken as a very strict sense of a 24-hour period of day. But like some, argue it could be taken as a more of a period of time, more representative. And so it's hard to say for sure. But what we do know, and of course what was the most important aspect of this whole thing, is that God saw the creation and it was good. That's the important part. Sometimes we want to argue and debate over things that the Bible did not see as at least not as important as we see it, or didn't sometimes ask the same questions that we might wish that it had answered. But what does Genesis 1 really point to? It points to the fact that the God of Israel is the God over all the world, over all the peoples, right? And that all peoples were made in his likeness. And that's a really powerful and amazing idea that would have been very strange to the ancient world. So that's kind of the point of Genesis 1. Well, let's go ahead and talk about Psalm 106 as well here. So let's read this together. So we have in verse 37, Va yizbechu et benechem. Va yizbechu et benechem. Va yizbechu et benechem. All right, so what do we have here? Well, the root word for this is zavak, which I believe we talked about, and that word means to sacrifice. So to sacrifice, and of course we have that va on the front, and as we've already seen, that yod plus the u at the end together means they. So as we see here, it's not just that he sacrificed, but they sacrificed. So, and they sacrificed et, again, just normally not translated, and then benechem. So we have bene, we talked about this word, means sons or sons of hem. And so hem is the word there, that pronoun for there. So, and they sacrificed their sons. So again, this et is helpful in the sense that it lets us know it's not their sons sacrificed someone or something else. It was that they sacrificed their sons, as we see here. So pretty tragic and horrific. And then we go on to see ve'et benotehem la shadim. Ve'et benotehem la shadim. Ve'et benotechem la shadim. So what do we have here? Again, we have the v and the et. Again, not translated necessarily. And benot. And this one's a little bit of an interesting word because you might think it's the word for son, ben, but it's actually the word for daughters. And that's because of this ot here. Now, if you remember this, the singular word for daughter is bat, right? But for daughters, plural, it's actually benot, which is kind of a little bit weird. So for whatever reason, bat is one daughter, but benot is many daughters. And ben is one son, and benim is many sons. So benotehem is there, right? We just saw that on the word in the last line. So their sons and their daughters. And then we see la, so 2 or 4, shadim. Shadim. And shadim is sometimes translated as demons, which I think is a fine way to say it, except that in the ancient times, it didn't quite have the same meaning that we might have when we say demons. There's certainly overlap, but the shadim is related to the word Shaddai, which is used of the Lord from various places, especially Genesis, even the book of Ruth. Naomi refers to the Lord as the Shaddaim. And so Shadaim really has the sense of like mountains, and so, or hills even. And so the Shadim were kind of like the gods of the mountains. So just like El is God and Elohim is gods, which doesn't have to mean the Lord God of Israel. It's just kind of a generic term meaning gods. I think kind of similarly, Shadim has this sense of gods, of the mountains, the mountain spirits, maybe even. And these were this was a common term or phrase in the region of Edom and Moab. And so we do also find out that it was very common and typical for the peoples of Moab and Edom, and in that general region, to sacrifice their children. That was a very common practice, unfortunately. And so it's very tragic, to know or to find out, or even just to think about people sacrificing their children to gods. And, what were they trying to do? What would be worth it? Well, they were seeking blessings. They were seeking a good life. They were seeking prosperity. They were seeking, to increase in their, opportunities in the world, in society, right? And so I think this is kind of an interesting point for us to consider, that we may have changed the way we think about this sometimes, but in many ways, our modern cultures are not so different. We oftentimes will sacrifice children for our own prosperity and for our own blessing. And, we may not say that it's to a particular god or to a spirit or to a demon, but it's sort of a sacrifice to similar purposes and causes. And at the very least, it's satisfying these very same demons from thousands of years ago. These demons loved and craved the death of humans, and it's not changed a single bit, right? Even in modern times, the enemy has remained the same in his love of destroying life. Whereas we know that the God above the gods, the greatest of all, Shadaim, right? Shaddai, the great God, he is the giver of life, and he loves life. And he puts into, laws and statutes, things that protect life and consequences for harming life. And so for those of us who seek to study and understand the Bible, it's important for us to really come to terms with the God of the Bible. Right? He is the God of life and life-giving, not life-taking. So this is kind of an interesting and frightening passage and idea, but again, maybe not so different from modern times, from ancient times. So let's go on here to look at another part of this passage from verse 39. And this is where we find our key word here. So let's read together. We have va yit meu ve ma'asehem. Va yit meu ve ma'asehem. Va yit meu ve ma'asehem. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we see our root word, right? Tameh, which means to be unclean, right? And of course, we see that va and plus the yod and the u. So remember, the yod by itself without the u means he, but with the u means they. So, and they were unclean, or maybe became unclean, ba or v here. And what does that v mean? Normally means like in, with, by, among, sometimes against. So here, perhaps with, or by, or perhaps because of. And then we see that hem at the end. Again, we've seen this already a couple times, meaning there. So, and they became unclean with or because of their deeds. Now you'll notice here, this word here is actually the root, asa. And we actually saw that in Genesis 1:31, right? All that God made, right? God saw all that he had made or did. And so this is actually the root here. And so sometimes there are just little extra letters added on, which can make it a little bit confusing, but this just turns it into basically a noun instead of the verb like we saw in Genesis 1. So this is just the noun form, a bunch of deeds. So, and they became unclean by their deeds. And then we have va yiznu be ma'al lechem. Va yiznu be ma'al lechem. Va yiznu ba ma'al lechem. All right, so what do we have here? Well, the root word here is actually zana, which means like to be unfaithful. It really is normally used in the sense of to be like a prostitute. So not just unfaithful, but like very sexually, promiscuous, even to the point of being a prostitute. But you can also kind of use it in the sense of like unfaithful in the sense of, a marriage. So being unfaithful. So again, we see this va and plus the yod and the u, right? So again, they were unfaithful. So again, this is paralleling that previous line, in or with or by. Hem, there, ma'ale. And so this is just another word meaning like deeds or actions, something like that. Again, just meant to parallel that previous line. So we have, they became unclean by their deeds, and they were unfaithful, or they became unfaithful by their deeds. Again, this is talking about their sacrificing of their children, right? Worshiping and serving these gods, especially for the sake of just their own pleasure and benefit. And, they may have weighed out the consequences of, giving up a child for economic gain in the sense of, well, if I sacrifice my kid, then it's going to help the whole community because we're going to get more rain, we're going to have more crops, things like that. And so you could see how they might be able to justify such a wild and crazy, horrible sounding thing. But like I mentioned, we're certainly just as capable. One thing you'll learn, and honestly you should have already learned if you've read the Bible at all, is technology has changed over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, but human nature has not changed much at all. We're still the same, just as we've always been. And that's why we need the goodness and the grace and the love and the mercy of a Savior, right? That God would forgive us and be merciful to us. So that's really kind of the message of the whole Bible. So a little bit of a downer verse here, but hopefully a good reminder for us to stay true to the Word of God and seek the God of life. Well, let's go ahead and finish up here with our alphabet. So let's go ahead and do it together. And we see here, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin. Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that is our 9th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So I hope you learned something. I hope you'll share something, and I look forward to seeing you next time.